So we're figuring out the average number of hours spent. So if we look at the midpoints, we're saying the people in this class spent 3.5 hours. So that's what we're actually trying to find the average for. So that's going to go into our L1. And then your frequencies or weights, depending on what type of problem you're looking at, those are going to go into L2. Okay, so L1 is going to be what you're actually taking the average of. Frequencies and weights are in L2. Okay, so I'm going to do that real quick. That edit. When you're done putting in your midpoints and your frequencies, your L1 and your L2 should be the same exact length. If they're lopsided, that means you missed one and you have to go in and fix it. They won't let you do this command if your L1 and your L2 are lopsided. It's going to give you an error. So double check before you actually run it. When you're done putting everything in, they end on the same line. Okay, so now we're going to go to stat, calc, 1-bar stats. Don't hit enter again. What we're going to do for this one, so if you've got one like mine where it's not new, you're going to, after you do 1-bar stats, you have to type in L1 and then a comma and then L2. So for mine, it's going to look like this when it's all said and done. So here from the screen, once you do 1-bar stats, don't hit enter because then it's just going to look at L1. You getting something different?
What if you have like just like a new calculator, then you just say enter?
Not quite yet. So second one, and then your comma button. Comma button is right here above your 7. That's your comma, so make sure you do second 1, and then comma, and then second 2 to get L2 to look like that. If you have a newer one where it asks you about your list and your frequency list, your list should be L1 because that's where you put your numbers, and your frequency list should be L2 because that's where you put your frequencies. And then you can hit calculate, and it should calculate it the same. So when I do that, I get my mean. It's 14.75. For my average. Right. Is anybody getting an error? Or they're getting a different number? Have trouble finding your comma button? Don't know how to put in L1 or L2? Anything like that? Okay, so for these ones, you have to know how to find your midpoint. Remember, don't use upper bounds for finding your midpoints. When you actually run through the program, if you have one like mine, don't forget to put L1, comma L2, otherwise it's just going to look at L1 and it's not going to take into consideration your frequencies at all. So just be sure you remember that one if you have one like mine. If you have the newer one like this, it's not too bad, just you have to remember, put your frequency list, but then when you go through and do it again, they're going to keep that frequency list there as L2. So the next problem you work, if it's not a grouped data and there's no frequency list, you have to be sure to delete that one. So that's the problem with this one, is you have to get rid of that one when you don't have a frequency distribution. Some people forget to do that. Usually when you forget, it'll give you an error because then your lists are lopsided. But sometimes people will miss it because they accidentally leave something in L2 and then it actually calculates and they get the wrong answer because they just forgot to take that frequency list off. So we've got a weighted mean. This is going to be different than a frequency distribution because we don't actually have a frequency in this case. We have weights instead. But if you look up here at the instructions, your frequencies or weights are going to have to be in L2. So when we put values into L2, we're gonna be putting whatever the weight happens to be. Since we don't have, frequencies. Okay, so he's going to this nut store. He's taking 1 pound of raisins, 2 pounds of peanuts, and 1.5 pounds of cashews. And they ask, what is the cost per pound of this mix? Hold on, before I put this in my calculator, let's see. Okay. All right, so, sorry, I'm skipping around a little bit. I don't want to put new data values in my L1 and my L2 because this one down here is the same numbers. So I don't want to have to put these in another time. So while I have them in there, I'm going to talk about the standard deviation first. So this one is going to be the same as what we did before. We actually already put our values in. So in L1, you're going to put the midpoints like we did previously. And then in L2, you're going to put the frequency. Sorry, this is at the very bottom of 3.3. And then if you find your standard deviation, back up a little bit, okay. Okay, so this is a survey asking first-year college students. So it's only 1,000 of them, so that's not going to be all first-year college students. So this is going to be a sample. So if we're looking at a sample, what would be our standard deviation? S. Yeah, anytime it's a sample, you're going to use S. Sigma would be if you have the entire population. So if you have a sample, you're going to have S equals our S. And again, since we have our N is 1,000, notice how close your S and your sigma are to each other. Because our N is so big, that means we have a whole lot of people in our sample. The bigger your sample size, the closer those things are actually going to be to each other. So my S is 8.11 for my sample standard deviation. So they'll ask you that one too. It's the same thing as the mean. Just put in your midpoints, your frequencies, run your 1-bar stats, and be sure to include L1 and L2. And then you just, like previously, you have to know the difference between S and sigma. So, sorry, I just wanted to talk about that while I still have those in the calculator. So, but standard deviation is not going to be too hard. And that's really the only kind. When you have these weighted ones here, you can't really have a standard deviation for that. I don't know if they actually even give you a standard deviation. Anyway, all right, so your weights are going to be in L2 because anytime you have weights or frequencies, those are going to be in L2. L1 is going to be the things that you're actually taking the average of. So they say, what is the cost per pound of this mix? So what's the average cost for each pound? So what we're taking the average of is the costs. That's what's going to go into L1. So in L1, we're going to put the costs. And then L2 is going to be their corresponding weights. So we've got raisins, peanuts and cashews, raisins are 125. This is 325. This is 540. 1 pound of raisins, 2 pounds of peanuts, and 1.5 pounds of cashews. So cost, these are going to be L1. Weight, that's going to be L2. Clear enter to get rid of those. Stat, calc, 1-bar stats. Don't hit enter again because otherwise it's just going to look at L1. It's going to find the average of the cost, and it's not going to take into consideration that you've got twice as many peanuts as you do raisins. It's just going to look at these 3 numbers. So be sure when you get to this step, you remember to type in second one, get L1, comma, second 2 to get L2, enter. And your average cost, I'm gonna round it to 2 decimal places because it's money. It's gonna be $3.52 for my X bar. Okay, so